Hey students of Lit 306E, it's Kathy Inman-Behrens talking with you about Henry Jenkins' book co-written with Sam Ford and Josh Green called Spreadable Media, Creating Value and Meaning in a Networked Culture. This is the new media part of our class. We've been working mostly on literary stuff. Now we're going to switch over for a little while to new medial contexts, and we're going to talk specifically about differences between broadcast logics and new medial or Web 2 logics. I'm going to begin with a few myths that I've identified. This isn't really in the book, but it's just sort of stuff I've thought about in relationship to this book, and then I'll go into defining a few key terms that Jenkins and the other authors identify. So I'll begin by talking about myth number one, which is that broadcast is dead. Broadcast is not dead, but it does have to accommodate for new modes of sharing and spreading ideas. Any broadcast entity can't control any longer the parameters of what it makes and how those things get shared. Even in-house things like a movie trailer, like one of the guest speakers in one of my classes at USC talked about how the in-house trailer made for Spider-Man, I think that was the Tobey Maguire version, actually got leaked, and a new version was made and remixed on the internet. Now this was a huge win, actually, in the sense that people were totally excited and engaged with the work, which is, of course, what any advertising wing of a large corporation is after. But that could also be perceived as piracy, right? Because this is proprietary material that was then spread and shared against the legal wishes of Warner Brothers. And so I guess that story sort of emblematizes how the logics of broadcast, which is we control the stuff and we hand it to you, our audiences, our consumers, our spectators, for you to enjoy it in ways that we've designed for you. But of course, Henry Jenkins and others talk about prosumers, people who are actually much more actively making meaning by remixing, sharing, spreading, and otherwise circumventing the logics of broadcast. Myth number two is that viral is the goal. This, again, is a broadcast mentality in which the goal of any advertising campaign or messaging campaign is to reach the broadest number of people. Spreadable media, however, attends to how micro-communities talk in and amongst themselves. And that, if we look at the Susan Boyle example that Jenkins and others cite, what made that truly a global phenomenon was that different stakeholders found different reasons to love it and share it and make it their own. The other piece that's missing, or usually missing in conversation of the Boyle phenomenon, is that, to be honest, the Britain's Got Talent just wasn't prepared for that viral moment. It couldn't make legal copies available to people who wanted it, and so demand drove what was deemed, the piracy, the desire to see illegal copies of Susan Boyle's audition tape. Virality is another one of those new medial elements that really has its heritage in a broadcast mentality. And I actually think that the concept of virality is a transitional moment between broadcast and more fully new medial modes of media exchange, because I think that many organizations are understanding that, I should say those that message best, are hitting small niche populations within their overall target audience, and then creating contexts in which those unique messages generated by participants in those small niche communities can ping off of each other and circulate more broadly in the culture. So I'm thinking about some of the work that Coca-Cola does, that Red Bull does, that Target does. There are some companies doing really good work with that kind of spreadability. But it definitely is not, virality as a metaphor really comes out of a biological image and practice. Jenkins and others talk about Rushkoff, about the idea that code replicates itself, that a meme replicates itself, and they think about the sort of cultural petri dish from which memes spring and then circulate. But the reason why Jenkins and Green and Ford object to virality as a metaphor is that it erases human agency, that people actually make memes, people actually decide what to spread and to whom to spread them. And a lot of the book is concerned with figuring out the cultural logics of how the things circulate and why. So if you even think about something like, they talk about the Joker meme, like that when Warner Brothers released the Chris Nolan Batman, that the Joker was taken up by 4chan, and a lot of memes came. 4chan created a series of members in 4chan created a series of memes that came out of that, some of which were repurposed by the Tea Party. And so one thing that's interesting, and I would imagine many other groups took up those memes and then put those messages to their own purposes. So one consistent medial object can actually mean many different things in the context of how it's shared. I think that we all have personal experience of this when we decide to share items on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or YouTube. The idea is that we're creating a message for a particular subset of people to be received by those people. It may travel beyond that group, and it may travel for reasons that the author intends or not. And that is part of the logic of spreadability, is that it's beyond the control of any creators how things will spread. So when marketers talk about trying to create a viral moment, what they're really saying is that we want to take broadcast logics into new media environments, and that's really quite a different thing. The third myth I'm going to talk about is that people expect digital stuff for free and they won't pay for it. It's true that people are accustomed to getting a lot of stuff for free, but if services can offer something that consumers can get more easily by paying for it, people will certainly do so. It's just that a lot of the services that are currently offered are based on a very restricted notion of copyright, and that people, if they can get versions that approximate the thing that's being sold, they can get versions for free or for less that do that, they're going to do so. It's really incumbent upon broadcast companies and others to think about how they're making offers unique value to people in these new environments. And that means that they need to start thinking about piracy, not from a position of legal copyright, which is itself undergoing constant and iterative transformation, but from a moral position. Like, do you want to actually be in the business of suing your fans? Do you want to be in the business of shutting down circulation of your content just as if it were your legal right, when what probably you'd rather do is attract more people into the work itself? One of the problems with that phenomenon is that occasionally when, say, media objects will circulate freely, some creators will say, well, gosh, I'll circulate Veronica Mars for free, but then I'll make up money in DVD sales later, or I'll make up money selling t-shirts later, or I'll make up money in different kinds of things. Those budgets sit in different places for an organization, and so one part of the organization might be paying more so that somebody else sees a profit, and that organizations are much more siloed than nonprofits usually, and that or just groups of ordinary people. So that's kind of one of the realities of how the business of circulation works. The fourth and final myth that I'm going to deal with or talk about is the idea that Web 2 is really only about the money. Of course, the myth of it, or one of the stories we like to tell ourselves, it's for you, it's YouTube, it's user-generated content, and so forth. The reality is that our attention is what pays for the web, and that is why even if you load ad blockers into your browsers, all it does, it doesn't actually stop browsers, usually like Facebook or Google or whomever, from tracking what you do. It just tracks your awareness. It just blocks your awareness of their tracking you. The way that the web gets paid for is by your attention, and that is to say by ad sales placed around content. Again, also a transitional moment from broadcast into new media. I would, for example, gladly pay a subscription fee to Google. I love their services. I use them on a daily basis, many, many times a day. I move between the suite all the time. If I could pay X number of dollars per month for that service, I would do so in exchange for my privacy, in exchange for not having myself tracked and aggregated and created into profiles that are sold to any number of buyers. But Google is not making that available to me, probably because they can make so much more money. I imagine it's a longitudinal play, that they'll make so much more money selling that information multiple times than they would make from me as an individual user, giving them any kind of subscription fee. But our attention absolutely pays for the web. So that's how it goes. But I also want to suggest, and this is something that's not in your assigned reading, but appears later in Chapter 2 in Spreadable Media, they spend a lot of time, the authors do, talking about traditional economies and gift economies, and that a lot of the logic of web sharing and sharing between microgroups is a gift economy, and that when the terms of the gift economy are violated by a corporation, for example, then that's when people get angry. So, for example, the example of fan subbing, where fans of a particular show will translate that show into their own native language, assuming that a lot of the product is coming out of Hollywood. So translating into, Chinese, or translating into whatever language, the media objects, fans will often do that for free, and they'll do that very quickly. It is only when organizations step in and try to profit from that gift, from that act of sharing, that the terms of the exchange are violated. And the book is really eloquent about why that violation not only disrupts how things flow between communities, but also shows the extent to which traditional corporate values just are going to have to be rethought in the context of new media. These videos on Spreadable Media are actually turning out a little bit longer than I want them to, but that's because I know a bit about these things, and trying to condense them all into one pretty concise lecture is a little bit challenging. Let me just go to a few key definitions. Like, first, we're going to talk about participatory culture, which Jenkins and others, but particularly Jenkins, historicizes in some very beautiful ways. I would refer you to his earlier work, Convergence Culture, for some kind of the primer on that. But what he talks about, and what they talk about, is that scrapbookers, zine makers, comic book makers, and other fan communities shaped how discourse about their own preferred media objects circulated, and that those practices, which we can go back much further than the 19th century, but which we do associate a lot with 19th century culture, those things totally inform how we work in these new medial environments today. Jenkins and others are working hard to dispel the myth that these fan practices are new. They're not really new. They're just manifesting themselves differently in the context of Facebook, Twitter, and other social media networking sites. So I want you to think a little bit about the sharing that we do as acts of curation, that you're curating bits and bobs that you find fascinating, and you're proffering them to very particular communities that you have in mind, and that you receive information in the same way. There's some Pew data in the chapter that you read in the introduction about how more and more we are getting our news from these micro communities that we're involved with. That, like for me, I have several communities that converge in my Facebook wall, and I get lots of different information from those different micro communities, and increasingly we're going to be getting information that way. Eli Pariser has written a very beautiful book called The Filter Bubble. Pariser is the guy who started MoveOn.org in response to the Monica Lewinsky scandal during the Clinton presidency. And, Pariser believes that the danger of receiving our information just from the people that we know is, of course, it's fairly homogenous, and that we're not going to still have a common culture of shared language for discussing our problems and working them through, which we're already beginning to see manifested in the gridlock that we see in Congress. I think that's really augmented by the idea that you can select the flavor of 24-hour news you like, if you're a Fox News person or a CNN person or an MSNBC or whatever. So those sorts of funnels of information flow definitely have an impact on civic life.